welcome to my next sew along. This time I'm making the Sonny Jacket from Tilly and the Buttons. I've already made one version of this jacket, as you can see, that I'm wearing now. This was part of a refashion project that I did, and I've done a short on it which you can see lower down on my channel. But this time I'm making a new version out of some lovely forest green needle cord. So let's get into it. So there's 4 design decisions to make with a Sonny jacket. The first one being the length. So you can either choose from the hip length, which is a sort of normal denim jacket length, or a cropped length. I made the cropped length in my first version and really like that on me and my frame, so I'm going to make that again. So the second decision is the collar. So you have the option of either classic style collar like this one here, or this longer prairie collar with a frill around the edge. But that one isn't really me or my style, so I'm going to stick with the classic collar for my second version. We then have the option of whether to include the pockets or not on this front panel here. On my first version I didn't include those because the fabric that I used was quite thick and bulky, and I just didn't feel like the pockets would do anything for the jacket and would be just too thick in that area. But this time I'm going to be using a thinner fabric, which I'll talk about later. So I do think I'm going to use those pocket pattern pieces on this occasion. And then finally, the fourth design decision is whether to line the jacket or not. So again, my first version was unlined, but this one I do think I'd like to do a lining. So you can see here on the packet envelope that the lining pattern is actually a separate pattern that you have to purchase in addition to this main pattern. It is only about £7, I think, from the Tilly and the Buttons website. So you need to download that too if you want to make the lining, which I am going to do for my version. So fabric options for the Sonny jacket are medium to heavyweight woven fabrics that hold their shape. And the options that they give are denim, twill, canvas, corduroy, jacquard or wool. So for my first version I used a polyester wool type fabric, and that was with my upcycling project that I showed you earlier. This time I'm going to be using this lovely forest green needle cord. So this was from Fine Fabrics of Harrogate, and I can't remember how many meters I got of this, but 2 or 3 I think, so I'll definitely have enough fabric for this project. But needle cord is fairly lightweight, so I think for this jacket what I'm going to do is interline it. So that means layering this needle cord fabric with another fabric underneath and then adding my lining. And so I've chosen to use up some of my calico scraps. So you can see here, this is very creased because it's just come out of the washing machine and dried. I haven't ironed it yet, but what I'll do is I'll cut my pattern pieces out of both, first of all the needle cord, and then the same pattern pieces out of these calico scraps, and then put them together as one, and then this needle cord then takes on a much more sort of structured shape and form, and that should hold the shape of the jacket much better than just using the needle cord on its own. And for my lining for my jacket I'm going to use this really bright, colourful, really lightweight fabric. I'm not quite sure exactly what the composition is of this because it was given to me as a gift. I didn't actually buy it directly from a shop, but I think it is a sort of georgette type material. So that's what I'm going to be using for my lining. Size wise, I'm always quite lucky with Tilly and the Buttons patterns because I sit quite neatly within their size 3, which is a 34 bust, 28 waist, and then my hip is 36, so that falls directly between the 2 and the 3, but I normally just go with a 3, which is 37, and just take into account the fact there might be a bit of extra ease in that area, and then as I'm sewing I'll take that in if I think it's necessary. So with regards to fabric preparation, I've already put all 3 of these fabrics through the washing machine at the normal temperature that I would wash my clothes, just to get rid of any shrinkage that there might occur in any of them before I make the garment up. I was a little bit tempted not to do this on this occasion because I don't really wash my jackets that often, I have to say, but I thought, well, I'm going to, just in case, because you can guarantee I'll probably spill something over this jacket once I've made it and then regret not having pre-washed it. So I now just need to give all three of these a good press with the iron, using lots of steam to get the creases out before I start cutting out my pattern pieces. So as I've made the Sonny jacket before, I've already cut out my main pattern pieces, but I haven't cut out the lining pieces. So this is the PDF pattern for the lining, and I just thought I'd show you how I'm setting this up to print it, to make sure that it prints out of the correct scale. So I am clicking on the scale button here and then changing the percentage to 100. And then that should ensure that when I print it prints out at the correct scale. If you just print out the first page to begin with and then measure this test square to see that it measures what it says it should, so that's 6 centimetres by 6 centimetres, then you know you're good to print out the rest of the pattern. I know different people have different ways of taping together their PDF patterns, but the easiest way that I found is to first of all cut off the right hand strip of your paper and the bottom strip of your paper on each of the sheets of the PDF pattern. And then you can place together your triangles on the pattern pieces like you can see here. So this is 1C on the left hand side of this sheet, and that matches up with a 1C on the right hand side, which has been trimmed off on the corresponding sheet. And then you just match them like this, make sure they're matching all the way down like that, and then just pop a piece of tape down to keep them in place. And then you do that for all of the sheets in your pattern until you've got the full pattern piece taped together. So if you're a complete beginner and you haven't cut out a pattern before, just to say that you need to look at the pattern size key, which is usually on all patterns, and then decide where your pattern size sits. So I'm cutting out a size 3, so I'm taking note of that type of line there, which is a solid line for size 3. And then I go over to my actual pattern pieces and I find the solid line, and then that's the one I'm going to follow and cut out all the way round. So now my pattern pieces are cut out in my main fabric, my interlining and my lining. So now I'm moving on to interlining each of my main fabric pieces, and as I said earlier, this is because this needle cord, which is a lovely fabric, but it is quite lightweight and I just want a bit more structure to it for my jacket. So I'm taking each of my main pattern pieces and matching them up with a corresponding piece that I've cut in either calico, or this is a bit of cotton twill because I didn't have enough calico scraps, so there's a mixture of the two, but basically I'm matching each of the pieces together, trying to do this one-handed because I'm carrying the camera at the moment, and I will take these to the sewing machine and then I'll sew around the edge within this normal seam allowance, so I'll probably use 3/8 of an inch, something like that. And then once that's sewn together, then I will just treat this as just one single piece, and then I'll do that to each of my each of my main fabric pieces before I actually start constructing the main jacket. So the first step in the sewing instructions is to do some stay stitching on the necklines of the front yoke, back yoke and the under collar. But I'm actually going to skip that because I've joined my interlining to my main fabric pieces. I've already effectively done some kind of stay stitching on my fabric pieces, so I'm going to skip that step. So that means I can now move on to pinning my centre front bodice pieces to the corresponding side front bodice pieces along the front bodice seams, right sides together and matching the notches. So both of those front bodice pieces have now been stitched with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance as per the instructions here, and I used a 8012 needle, just for your information. It's just a standard type needle which was fine for this type of fabric, and in terms of a stitch length I just used the standard that was on my sewing machine, which is 2.4 millimeters. So I'm now moving on to creating the mock flat felled seams. So I've first of all overlocked just the centre front bodice seam allowance. I'm then going to trim the opposite seam allowance, which is the side front bodice seam allowance, down by about half. I'm then going to press the seam open and then press it over to the side seam, which is this side, and then I'm going to turn it over and top stitch about 3/8 of an inch from this seam here, and that's going to create the nice mock flat felled seam. So now my flat fell seams have been sewn and it's starting to create that nice lovely shaping in the front bodice. I'm now going to attach my yoke pieces. So I'm going to be placing the yoke pieces right sides together on the appropriate side, sewing along the top here at 5/8 of an inch, and then creating mock flat fell seams on these seams as well, in the same way that I did with these vertical seams here. So I'll do that on the left and right piece and also on the back pieces too. Just a quick tip for doing the top stitching on your mock flat fell seams: because you are top stitching, the needle plate and therefore the seam allowance guide is covered by a fabric, so you won't be able to use that to gauge your seam allowance. So for these seams we're sewing at 3/8 of an inch, so I have just measured the distance between the needle and the edge of my foot, and luckily for me that is 3/8 of an inch, so I'm just able to run the edge of my foot down my previous seam, and then that helps to ensure that I have got a nice even 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. So I'm now moving on to constructing my pocket pieces. So the first step for doing that is to overlock each of the 4 sides of both of your pocket pieces. Then we need to turn over the top edge by 1/4 of an inch and then another 3/8 of an inch, and then top stitch that from the right side. And then finally we need to fold over the remaining 3 sides over by 5/8 of an inch. And then the next step, I believe, is going to be putting those onto our front bodice pieces. So the main pocket pieces are now sewn on. I found the placement of those by locating the reference points on the paper pattern, putting those onto my bodice front and then aligning the square pocket against those, and then sewing around the edge, top stitching around with about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So I now need to deal with the pocket flap pieces. So I'm going to be taking each of those, placing them right sides together like that, sewing round the sides, the bottom edge, and leaving this open at the top, then turning those right sides out after trimming the seam allowances down to reduce bulk, and then giving them a good press and a top stitch, and then they'll be ready to pop onto the bodice. So here I'm just trimming and grading the seam allowances. So I'm going to cut them down by about half to start with, all the way around. And then I'm going to grade them down, so I'm going to find the middle layer there and then trim this top layer down by about half again, and that helps to reduce bulkiness in that area. I'm also going to snip across the corners diagonally to get rid of any bulkiness in that area too, being very careful not to snip into my stitching line. And then I'm going to turn it right sides out. And I just need to grab my point turner just to get into those points and make them nice and crisp. And now I'm going to top stitch around these bottom and side edges. So I'm now ready to attach my pocket flap piece. So I'm going to align it centrally over the main pocket piece here, and then I'm going to sew 3/8 of an inch from this raw edge here. So that will fall literally just probably in line or very fractionally below the seam here of the yoke. Once I've done that, I will trim as much as I can from this raw edge here, and then fold the flap over like that, and then top stitch along the top here to hold it down in place. So that's now sewn, and I'm just going to carefully take my scissors and try and cut away as much of this seam allowance here as I can. And the purpose of that is just to reduce any bulkiness in that area as much as we can. And I'm going to fold that over like that and then top stitch along here. So now our pockets are installed on our front bodice pieces. So now we're going to attach the front bodice to the back bodice at the shoulder seams. So this is the back bodice piece, and I'm just laying my front bodice pieces right sides together, matching the shoulder line, and I'll pin those in place and then take them to the sewing machine, sew them at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then also make the mock flat felled seams like we've done on the other areas. So now it's time to work on our front facings. So we need to lay the front facings, which are these bits, over the back facing, which is this bit, right sides together, and aligning these shoulder seams here like that. So this right angle corner should be on the inside for both of these pieces, and then we're going to sew a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance on both sides here. Then we need to trim those seam allowances down, press them open, and then the next step also asks us to finish the outside edge of the whole facing with an overlocker. So that's all around here. So I'll go away and do that and come back and see you shortly. So that's our facing pieces joined, back facing and then the two front facings joined at the shoulder seams, and then overlocked all the way around the outside edge. So that can now be put away to the side, and we need to start working on our collar piece. So the collar is placed with the two pieces right sides together on top of each other, and then we need to sew across the short side, or short end, all the way down the bottom and back up here, but leave this top section open so that we can turn it right sides out. So here I am just trimming and grading the seam allowances for my collar piece. Now it's sewn together,
and I will then turn it right sides out and turn out the corners with a point turner like I used for the pocket pieces. So the collar is now sewn. I have turned it right sides out, given it a press, and I have basted together the open raw edges along here just to hold them in place while the collar is inserted into the jacket. So now we need to place the collar piece right sides together. So the pattern instructions suggest that you use the uninterfaced under collar, and that should be placed against the right side of the back neckline, and then you just need to match the notches. So there's one at the centre back there that matches, there's another one part way round the back neckline there, and then there is another final one on the front yoke piece just there, which signifies the end of the collar, and that will be mirrored on the other side too. So they need to be pinned in place and then taken to the sewing machine and tack that in place, and the instructions suggest just under 3/8 of an inch seam allowance.
So I've now completed steps 1 to 20 of the Sonny jacket, and this is what it's looking like. So as you can see, the collar is in, the pockets are on the front bodice, the back is sewn with the yoke piece in place. So now all that's really remaining are the sleeves. But because I want to line my jacket, I now need to transfer over to the secondary pattern pieces and instructions, which were an additional £7 from Tilly and the Buttons. I think I mentioned that earlier. So I need to do that now, get the lining installed and finish off the jacket.
So the first step in the lining process is to stay stitch the back neckline. So we stay stitch at 3/8 of an inch, so within the normal seam allowance, from one shoulder to the centre and the other shoulder to the centre, and that's to make sure that it doesn't stretch out in different directions as you sew. And then the next bit is to create the pleat in the back. So I've already gone ahead and done that. So you first of all, you should have marked the notches when you cut out the pattern. Bring those back notches together on top of each other, and then sew from the raw edge down to the end of the pleat marking, which is about 2 inches or so. And then you pinch the pleat in the middle and push it down so that the excess folds over equally on each side, and then just sew some basting stitches across the top. So it should look like that from the inside. So then we can move on to the pleats on the front bodice lining pieces. So this is what it looks like on the pattern. Here's our pleat lines, which is on the side seam, and all we're doing with this is folding those pleats on top of each other like that. So you would have marked those pleats on your fabric piece, and then you need to sew across the pleat there, and then once that's sewn, then you press the pleat downwards. So on the fabric that looks a bit like this. So I've marked my 2 notches for my pleat, fold those on top of each other, sew about 1 centimetre across there, whatever the length of the pleat is, and then take it to the iron and press it downwards, and that's our side seam of the lining piece on the front. So we now need to join our front and back bodice lining pieces together at the shoulder seams and at the side seams. So I've gone ahead and I've pinned those in place both on the right and the left, and you should find that your front lining bodice piece matches the length of the back lining bodice piece at the side seam now that you've sewn your pleat in place. That's shortened this length of fabric to match the length of fabric on the back piece. So I'll take that to the sewing machine now and sew on both the right and left hand sides and at the shoulders. So the next step is to work on the lining sleeves. So I've got one of my sleeves laid out here and I'm going to fold it right sides together and match the side seams here. So I'll be matching the notches and then pinning all the way down here so that both ends meet at the cuff. One thing to note on this is that one side we need to sew all of the way down. On the second side, I don't think it really matters which one, but you need to sew from the end or the top underarm intersection here to the first notch, leave a gap, and then reinstate the sewing from the second notch down to the cuff area. And that's so that we can leave a hole to turn things through once we get to the end of the process. So we just need to remember to leave that gap and perhaps put a double pin on either end at the notches to remind yourself to stop and start at those points. So our two sleeves are now sewn. This one is the one which has the full seam sewn right from the top to the bottom, and this is the one where there is a gap between the notches. So now, having done that, we need to insert those sleeves into the bodice that we created earlier. So the way that I do that is I've got my bodice in this hand and I've got my hand poking out of the armhole. I've got my sleeve in my right hand, and I first of all match up the side seam of the bodice with the underseam of the sleeve. So I place those right sides together and pop in a pin, and then I work my way around and find the next notch. So on the back sleeve, on the back bodice, there is 2 notches, as you can just about see there. So I'm matching those up on the armhole and the sleeve. And then we'll probably flip through to the wrong side and follow my sleeve round until I get to the shoulder seam, and I'm going to match that up with the notch that I've got at the top of my my sleeve there. I'm then moving round to the front of my sleeve and matching up the one notch that's on the front of the front armhole with the one on the sleeve, which is here, and I'll pop in another pin, and then I'll just fill in the gaps of the pins to make sure that the whole circular area of the armhole is pinned together. And then I'll take that to the sewing machine and sew it with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance.
So now our lining sleeves are installed, we need to start working on the hanging loop. So this is the loop pattern piece. Oh, that's the pattern, this is the fabric. I've gone ahead already and overlocked one long edge. And now the instructions tell us to press the unfinished long edge, which is this one, over by 3/8 of an inch, which is about that. Press that with an iron and then fold this edge over like that, and then top stitch down each long edge. So that's what I'm going to do now. So here's my loop all stitched. I did actually find that when I did the top stitching on both sides, the one side didn't actually catch the overlocking edge, so I actually did another stitch down the middle and the centre, which I think still looks okay. So yeah, that's now done and ready to be put into the lining. So to install the hanging loop into the lining, we need to pin the wrong sides of the loop to the right sides of our back lining and match the hanging loop notches. So there's some notches around here, and I'm just going to place them down like that. And then we just need to
tack or baste across here at the 3/8 of an inch level with the sewing machine. So now we're going to attach our facing to our lining. So this is the back neck facing here, and this is the front facing. So the first place to align is the centre back of the lining with a notch at the top of the back facing. So I popped a pin in there, which is almost sort of directly between the two hanging loops. I then go down to the bottom, and I've matched, or I'm about to match, the bottom notch of the facing with the bottom notch on the lining. I'm popping a pin there, and then work our way up. There's another notch here on the front facing and the front bodice, so I'm popping a pin in there, and then I just need to work my way around, matching the raw edges and easing in any fullness that we've got. I'm doing that on both sides, and then taking it to the sewing machine and sewing all the way around, over the top and then down the other side. I just thought I'd show you what I mean by easing in the fullness. So sometimes you might have one length of fabric that looks too big to go into the other length of fabric and match it up neatly. So what I would normally do when that happens is to quarter the fabric. So I match up the pins that I've already got in place and find the midpoint on that side, and then do the same here, and then pull those two pins together, and then you've got the middle section. And then potentially you can even do that again, so you can quarter that, find the midpoint on that side, find the midpoint on the other side, match those together, and that just makes it a little bit more easy to ease in that extra length. And then you'll find that this side now goes in quite nicely, fits really well. Okay, so the lining is now attached to the facing all the way around. I've just completed that at the sewing machine, and it was fairly tricky to get it in around the neckline, I have to say, even with the easing, but I think it's in okay. So now I just need to trim these seam allowances down and notch little triangles into the curved areas to help it sit flatter, and then give it a good press with the iron. Okay, so I think there is a slight discrepancy on the instructions that I found, unless I'm missing something, but the main jacket instructions say to stop after you have attached the collar and then move on to lining your jacket with the other instructions. However, I'm now using those instructions and have got to the stage where I'm wanting to attach my lining and facing piece to the main jacket, but the sleeves aren't yet inserted, the main sleeves. So I think there's a bit of an error or a missing section on that. So anyway, to cut a long story short, I have now sewn the under seam of both of my sleeves. I have trimmed the seam allowances, pressed them open, and I'm now going to insert them into my main jacket in the same way that I did for the lining sleeves. So I'll do that, and then once that's done, I should be on track to get back to the lining instructions. So now that I've sewn up the side seams and inserted the sleeves into the main jacket, I can now go back to the lining instructions. So I'm now on step 14, which is attaching the facing and lining unit to the main jacket. So this is what mine looks like at this present moment. So this is the main jacket, and then this is the facing and lining unit, and I'm literally matching the raw corresponding edges, so the edge of the jacket here and the edge of the facing, the corner there, going all the way down the centre front, and then matching the collar around here all the way around to the other side, and this corner here of the opposite centre front, and then down to the bottom. So I'll be pinning those in place and then sewing all the way around. Just a very quick point to make on step 14, just to remember when you're stitching around the facing, the front openings are at 5/8 of an inch and the neckline is 3/8 of an inch. But I think there is a very small typo in the instructions here, because on the second reference to the front opening, it refers to 15mm and then 3/8 of an inch, whereas that should actually say 5/8 of an inch, unless I'm mistaken. So just a point to watch out for. So the facing unit and the lining has now been sewn into the main jacket, as you can see here, and I have gone ahead and trimmed my seam allowances and graded them to reduce bulk in this area, and then I've understitched the seam allowances to the facing. You can see that line of stitching down there. So I now just need to give them a good press, and that understitching should help the facing just roll nicely to the inside. So this is now step 17 in the lining instructions. So I've got the jacket now wrong sides out, so inside out. This is the right side of the jacket, and then obviously the wrong side of the lining, so right sides are together basically. I've turned the facing over along the stitching line where it attaches to the bodice, lifting the lining out of the way. Just turn this little section here over to the wrong side, and then I'll stitch across here with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, making sure the lining is out of the way. And apparently, according to the instructions, there should then be a little gap at the top here, which we'll fix later on. So yeah, I did take a little while to get my head around those instructions, but that's what I think we need to do. So now we're on to step 18, which is to pull the linings together. So the the hems together. So we've got the lining hem and the main jacket hem, and we need to match them in the corners. So this one feels really awkward, and it does say in the instructions that the facing won't sit flat, and just to trust the process. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to pin from here all the way along, matching the side seams, the lining and the jacket, and just do the same all the way across, and then stitch that with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So my hem is now stitched, and I have gone ahead and trimmed those allowances down by about a 1/4 of an inch. And now the next step is to deal with the sleeves. So we need to pull the sleeves wrong sides out. So my lining is already pulled out. I just need to pull my main sleeve out as well and reach through and grab it. And then we need to turn the cuffs, or the end of the sleeves, under to the wrong side by, it says, about 1.5 inches. So something like that, and I'll take my seam gauge and just measure that to make sure. It doesn't say to press it, but I probably will give it a press. Actually, I don't think there is any need to press it, but so I'll just leave it measured approximately 4 inches there. Sorry, not 4 inches, 4 centimeters. So this is the outer arm, this is the lining. Both of them are inside out, and then we need to pull this lining sleeve over this cuff area like that, and align the raw edges. So we're basically putting the outer sleeve into the lining like that, and making sure that we are aligning the underseam of the sleeve with the same position of the lining, and that the sleeve is not twisted at all. And then we need to pin that in place, take it to the sewing machine and sew it with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So our sleeves and our lining sleeves are now attached, as you can see here. That's the seam line, and I've trimmed the seam back by about 1/4 of an inch. So now we need to find that hole that we left, or the gap in the lining sleeve, and then pull the whole jacket through that gap. So that's going to be a bit of a task, but I'll make a start on it on camera and then show you the end result. And there she is, the jacket's been born through the hole in the sleeve. So it's looking a little bit dishevelled. We need to reach inside again through that hole to pull out and pinch out these corners. But yeah, we're getting there. So now we're securing the lining to the jacket at the armpit by sewing a thread chain. Tilly and the Buttons have a really good tutorial on this on their website, which I'll try and put a link to. Okay, so we're now on to some of the final steps in the process. So the next one is to close up the hole in the lining sleeve that we turned the jacket through with. So we need to reach through and grab that sleeve like that, and then find that hole which is there and pinch it together. So I think I had previously folded and pressed in the seam allowances. You can probably see that there. So that should just be quite easy to pin along here and then sew with about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance across the top to close that gap up. Okay, this is very exciting, the last few steps. So I just need to give the overall jacket a good press and then press the lining into place at the hem here. It's meant to sit about 1.5 centimetres, 5/8 of an inch above the actual jacket hem. Then just need to do some slip stitches in this corner here. If you remember, we left that bit open, so we just slip stitch that closed, and then do the buttonholes. So very exciting, and I'll show you my progress very soon. So I've gone ahead and chosen the buttons that I want for my jacket. I've chosen these nice ones, which I actually salvaged from an old cardigan that I used to have. And there's only 4 of them. So I've evenly spaced them out across the jacket. Even though the pattern suggests 5 buttons, I think 4 will be fine for what I'm looking for. So yeah, I just need to sew in the buttonholes and then sew on the buttons. So nearly finished. And here is the finished jacket.